Well, it's good to have you here for this discussion on the sanctity of life. I like here we have some quotes from the Talmud as well as Mother Teresa on simply the importance of life. The Talmud says, "He who saves one life is as if he saved an entire world." We're going to talk maybe a little bit about what that means, saving one life, saving an entire world. Mother Teresa said, "For me, life is one of the most beautiful, is the most beautiful gift of God to mankind." Now, if you have seen some of these, if you have been a parent and you look at these ultrasounds, for most people, they just kind of look a little squiggly and it's hard to see what they are. But when you see your child for the first time uh, inside the mother, it's quite an amazing thing. There you can see the little profile of this one of my children, and it just stirs something up inside you when you look at these beautiful little ones. I thought we would start by looking at something that Elder Neil L. Anderson had to say about little kids. I think and having children, I think it's a good place for us to frame our discussion.
It is a crowning privilege of a husband and wife who are able to bear children, to provide mortal bodies for these spirit children of God. We declare that God's commandment for his children to multiply and replenish the earth remains in force. We go forward in faith, realizing the decision of how many children to have and when to have them is between a husband and wife and the Lord. My daughters recently referred me to a blog written by a Christian mother not of our faith with 5 children. She commented, "Growing up in this culture, children rank way below college, below world travel for sure, below the ability to go out at night at your leisure." She then adds, "Motherhood is not a hobby. You do not collect children because you find them cuter than stamps. It's not something you do if you can squeeze the time in. It is what God gave you time for." And Jesus took a child in his arms and said, "Whosoever shall receive one of such children in my name receiveth me, and whosoever receiveth me receiveth him that sent me."
I just love that little video with Elder Anderson talking about the great, wonderful things about having kids and about how it's a very godly thing to do. Now, some are understandably have a lot of trepidation about having children. I think if you don't, you probably ought to take another look, because it is a major life change to have kids. But I think sometimes we think about kids just in the generic sense, like having kids. For instance, I don't just have kids, I have Gwendolyn, and I have Cecily, and I have Will, and I have Ada, and I have Lucy, and I have Thomas. These are the kids that I have. These are these people with whom I have these eternal relationships. And so I don't think about myself as having kids in just kind of just generic sense. I think of these individual people who I have, who are a part of my life now and forever. And that's a very different thing from just thinking about having kids. Now, what does sanctity mean? We're talking about the sanctity of life. And of course, that's a phrase from the proclamation that we affirm the sanctity of life. If you look up sanctity, you get definitions like kept or regarded as inviolate from ordinary use. In other words, there's some things that we just use ordinarily, other things that are separate from that. Another definition you get of sanctity is often holy. Well, what does holy then mean? Holy means pertaining to God or the divine persons, having their origin or sanction from God, or partaking of a divine quality or character. In other words, when something is sacred, it is set apart. It is something unique from all other things, right? We have the temples that are the holiness to the Lord. They're separated. They're the Lord's. There are many things in our lives, I think, that the Lord doesn't frankly care a whole lot about. For example, you probably prayed over your breakfast this morning, but you might not have prayed about what you were going to eat. Should it be this cereal or that cereal? You might not have prayed about which shirt to wear today, right? There are some of these things where you consider, you know what, those are probably in our domain to make decisions about. But there are other things that the Lord says are holy, are sacred, are sanctified, that it's within the Lord's domain to make decisions about those. The Lord's priesthood, of course, the Lord's church, how ordinances are performed. All of those things are within the domain of the Lord. And we understand that pretty well, right? The Lord gets to make the decisions on how those things are used. What the Lord is also saying here by saying the sanctity of life means that life is within the Lord's domain, that the Lord gets to choose how life comes about and how it is taken, right? So we're putting that in the realm of the Lord's domain to make decisions about. Here I love from the church just consistently emphasizes the dignity of human life, that all human life is valuable. This commentary from the church's newsroom says, sometimes it seems like life problems are too big for us to solve. The world is rife with poverty, hunger, war, and much more. No matter how hard we try or how much money, technology we employ, these challenges persist. And yet, we have no choice but to continue seeking solutions, because each person is precious, and precious beyond comprehension, and eternal soul. From its beginning in the womb to its final breath, and at each stage in between, every human life is endowed with dignity, created in the grace of God's image. From cradle to grave, in other words, each human life is of infinite value. Please know that your life is of infinite value. Now, here's some student comments on the readings that I received in the past. One student said, I was surprised by the straightforward talks on abortion. I was surprised by this reading. The readings were so straightforward, exclamation point. I was surprised at how direct these readings were. Sometimes when we see these kinds of readings, we think, wow, I didn't know the church really did feel so strongly about this particular thing. And sometimes we're a bit surprised because this seems to overlap with politics. And wait, the church doesn't get involved with political things, right? And so I thought what we do is just really quick review what the church's policies are on politics. So this is just a statement from the church's website on political neutrality. And it's saying what the church doesn't do. It doesn't do a few things like endorse or promote political parties or candidates. Churches' buildings can't be used for political purposes, for partisan political purposes, I should say. Doesn't attempt to direct its members on which candidate or party they should give their votes to. This policy applies to whether or not a candidate for office is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and doesn't attempt to direct or dictate to a government leader. In other words, what the church doesn't do is it doesn't play partisan politics. It's not going to endorse a political candidate, and it's also not going to say this party is good or bad. So what does the church do? Well, it does a few things, and here it outlines some of those things, like encouraging its members to be involved in politics. But I want to address this last one right here. It does reserve the right as an institution to address in a nonpartisan way issues that it believes have significant community or moral consequences. And I think this is really, really important that the church does. In other words, if the church sees that there's some kind of harm to society, it'll get involved. If the church sees that people might be harmed by something, if society might be harmed by something, it feels the obligation to get involved. And personally, I'm very grateful for a church to do that. History is rife with examples of institutions not getting involved when there were serious problems occurring within politics, when harm may occur. So when it sees that, or that last part, that directly affects the interests of the church, it gets involved then. So, for example, let's do a thought experiment. Let's say that Governor Boggs, who issued the extermination order back in Missouri, were to come back from the dead and get elected governor of Utah and say, we're going to exterminate the Mormons again. Do you think that the church probably should get involved in that kind of a political thing? Yeah, most people would agree with that. Well, what if it was, for example, the Buddhists that were going to be exterminated or driven out? Do you think the church should say something? Right? Most people would agree that there are certain instances where, yeah, this is going to cause harm, and so we need to get involved in that. And guess what? The prophets being involved in politics is of long standing. If the church perceives danger, it gets involved. If you go back to, again, this is of long standing, Helaman 8 verses 3 through 2, here we have Nephi, and he's saying his prayer, and he's commenting on the politics of the day. And then you have the kind of wicked individuals that say this: why seest thou this man, and hearest him revile against this people and against our law? For behold, Nephi had spoken unto them concerning the corruptness of their law. In other words, the prophet was speaking against their laws because they had become corrupt. Church also, I think, takes very seriously these mandates. Ye are the light of the world. Ye are the salt of the earth. The church is like unto leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal, till the whole was leavened. In other words, the church has a responsibility to say something when the world is maybe a bit in darkness, right? When there are bad things going on, that the church has the responsibility to say something. And if those things are political, well, then that's okay, right? Some people worry, well, what about the church's tax-exempt status? Because isn't it getting involved in politics against the tax-exempt status? The answer is no, as long as it doesn't so in a non-partisan way, as long as it doesn't promote a particular candidate or a particular political party. Now, the church's position on a particular politics, I sometimes fear that we seek for what the church is saying about it, and then we stop our process of discovery. We don't think anything beyond then. Some people, they hear what the church thinks, and then, okay, I got it. I'm not going to think any more about it. I'm for it. Other people, okay, I know what the church says, and I'm definitely against it, right? You might know people on both sides of those. I think we need to ask follow-up questions like, why would the church take a particular position that it does? What is the importance to society? And so that's what I want to do today for a little while about abortion. Find out what is the church's position, and then think about, well, why would the church take that particular position? All right, here we have our discussion, the church's statement on abortion. And the church simply says, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believes in the sanctity of human life. There's that word again. Therefore, the church opposes elective abortion for personal and social convenience, and counsels its members not to submit to, perform, encourage, pay for, or arrange for such abortions. The church allows for possible exceptions for its members when pregnancy results from a rape or incest, or a competent physician determines that the life or health of the mother is in serious jeopardy, or a competent physician determines that the fetus has severe defects that will not allow the baby to survive beyond birth. Now, here's what I think is an important addition here. The church teaches its members that even these rare exceptions do not justify abortion automatically. Abortion is a most serious matter that should be considered only after the persons involved have consulted with their local church leaders and feel through personal prayer that the decision is correct. The church has not favored or opposed legislative proposals or public demonstrations concerning abortions. So in other words, it doesn't get involved in specific aspects of legislation, but it does counsel its members about abortion in these ways. Now, let's see if we can look at some rationale that might help us to understand some of that. And to that, I want to go to Mother Teresa. If you know much about Mother Teresa, you know she was very vocal about abortion. She had this to say: America needs no words from me to see how your decision in Roe v. Wade, the decision to legalize abortion, has deformed a great nation. The so-called right to abortion has pitted mothers against their children and women against men. It has sown violence and discord at the heart of the most intimate human relationships. It has aggravated the derogation of the father's role in an increasingly fatherless society. It has portrayed the greatest of gifts, a child, as a competitor, an intrusion, and an inconvenience. What is taking place in America is a war against the child. If we can accept that the mother can kill her own child, how can we tell other people not to kill one another? Now, I want to take what Mother Teresa has to say here seriously. Interesting, if you note here, she's not appealing to God. She's not saying, well, God said so. She's actually appealing to things that are more on the ground, the lives of individuals. And it's important to recognize that Mother Teresa was not this cloistered nun. She wasn't out apart from society. She was in it. She was in it day in and day out. And it seems to be that these sorts of observation comes from her own experience. So I want to take Mother Teresa quite seriously here and look at each one of her points. First, pitting mothers and fathers against children, portraying the greatest gift as a competitor, an intrusion, and an inconvenience. I want to go to Cynthia Hallen. She's a professor here at Brigham University, and she had this to say. She said, elective abortion is a serious moral problem because it pits the social, emotional, personal, psychological, or financial concerns of adults against the innocent lives of unborn children. Women cite financial trouble and pregnancy outside of marriage as the most frequent reasons for having an elective abortion. In other words, what Cynthia Hallen is saying here is that what abortion is doing is it's saying, okay, when you have abortion for any reason, you can have all of these social, emotional, or psychological financial issues, and you can put them on the scale with life, with the life of the unborn. And she's basically saying that putting life on that kind of a scale is inappropriate. In fact, is a serious moral problem that nothing should life should never be put on a particular scale and pitted against social, emotional, or psychological, financial things. That it is of greater worth than any of those things. And so to start putting human life on that scale in the first place is a serious moral problem. All right, let's go back to Mother Teresa and go to this second point here where it says discord in intimate relationships, pitting mothers against fathers. Something we often don't recognize, but is really important here to understand, is that the most common reason or way that fathers are involved in an abortion is the father pressuring the mother to have an abortion. Very sadly, sometimes when the father doesn't want to have the child, he can say, well, I'm not going to pay for the child. Well, I'm not going to support you if you have this child. I'm going to leave. And so he uses those things as a lever against the mother. And when you have abortions for any reason, it allows those men to have power over women in this very scary way, right? And so you have discord in these most intimate of relationships. Now, number 3, the derogation of the father's role. I want to go to something that I think is helpful for us to understand. So here's a male student comment. And what the student had to say was, I try to put myself in her shoes, right? A woman who may be considering having abortion, even though I'm a guy. And I feel like it would be so hard. I have no idea, and I have no credibility to speak at all. Just a thought, right? So in other words, this man's saying, you know what? I really have no credibility to speak on this. This isn't a thing of mine, right? It's the woman. It's her decision. So I really don't have any credibility to speak on this point. Well, I think it's important to recognize that each one of these unborn children also has a father. And so often in the abortion debate, we forget that and we derogate the father's role. In other words, we say, well, the father really isn't important in this particular situation. Here's from the BBC reporting on ethics and a father's rights regarding the unborn child. Said the BBC, the abortion issue is largely devoted to dealing with the rights of the fetus and the mother. The rights and concerns of the father are rarely discussed. The most common case concerning fathers and abortion is when the father wants the mother to have an abortion and she doesn't, like we mentioned. But sometimes the mother wants an abortion and the father wants her to have the baby. Is an abortion ever morally wrong because it transgresses the father's rights? In other words, there have been many instances where the woman wants to have an abortion and the father says, no, please do not kill this child. This is my child. I want to see this child grow up. I want to see this child in their first birthday. I want to see this child go through school, go through high school. I want to have a relationship with this child. Please don't kill the child. Now, in the courts, when the fathers have begged for the life of their children, basically America and in the United Kingdom both have said, no, the fathers have no rights. The father has no say in the life of his unborn child. Now, is it morally right that he would have a right to veto what the mother has to say? Does the mother and the father have a 50-50 say? Well, if it has a 50-50 say and they're disagreed, well, then nothing happens. Does the mother have 51 and the father have 50? Well, if the mother has 51, then really the father has no say at all. The problem is that when you have abortion for any reason, you get stuck in these moral quandaries. It is a knot that cannot be untied. It necessarily creates these moral ambiguities and these moral difficulties. So going back to what Mother Teresa had to say here, it's a number 3, a derogation of the father's role, where the father essentially gets cut out of a say in the life of his children. Now, point number 4, the devaluation of life in general. When abortion is available for any reason, we see life as a whole as being of less worth. I want to go to this NPR report on genetic testing for Down syndrome. One of the greatest concerns about this is that when it's found out that an unborn child has Down syndrome, that they will be aborted. In fact, we see that in many places around the world where Down syndrome is disappearing, and many people, advocates, say that that's not a good thing, that these individuals would be disappearing. So quoting from NPR, this NPR report saying, advocates for people with Down syndrome have their worries. People with Down syndrome are artists, they're poets, they're athletes. Their lives are happy ones and fulfilling ones. I have a sister with Down syndrome who certainly is a life coach for not only myself, but for my entire family, says Brian Skotko, co-director of the Down syndrome program at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. If the new tests become a routine offering, then we have to start to ask, will babies with Down syndrome slowly start to disappear? And in fact, what we're seeing is that they are slowly starting to disappear, that their lives are not seen as valuable as other people's lives because, well, maybe they'll be an inconvenience, seen as an inconvenience in one way or another. Here's what President Nelson had to say. To deny life to an individual because of a possible handicap is a very serious matter. Policy consistent with that logic would dictate that those already living with such deficiencies should likewise be terminated. One more step in that tragic train of thought would lead to the conclusion that those who are either infirm or inconvenient should be eliminated. Such irreverence for life would be totally unthinkable. And yet, very much so, that's where we're going in our society. So it was mentioned in the church's policy that there are exceptions, such as in case of rape, incest, danger to the mother's life. and the baby cannot survive beyond birth. But the church also does say that even in these rare exceptions, do not justify abortion automatically. Abortion is a most serious matter and should be considered only after the persons involved have consulted with their local church leaders and feel through personal prayer that their decision is correct. In other words, if life is in God's hands, then the decision should be left to the Lord. And that consulting with church leaders, not that the church leaders can veto it, but that the church leaders can give some good guidance and help the couple to think through the situation. But then ultimately, life is in the hands of God. Now, important, we don't judge others. This could be a statement on the end of every single slide that we ever have during the semester. But here I think it's extra important. Finding the Lord would have you terminate a pregnancy may be the most difficult decision. Right? And so when couples are making these kinds of decisions, we don't judge them. We leave it between them and the Lord. Now, some individuals would say, well, why would the church allow for exceptions in the first place? I think Dr. Valerie Hudson, who's one of the foremost leading experts on women's study and women around the world, she had this to say about an incident where a 10-year-old girl had been raped by her stepfather and become pregnant. Now, of course, this is a very, very dangerous situation for this young girl. And the country she was living in, their laws on abortion were based on the Catholic model, which allows abortion in absolutely no circumstances whatsoever. So Dr. Hudson contrasts the Latter-day Saint view with the Catholic view. And I think it's important that she's making this contrast because she was Catholic. She grew up Catholic, later converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So she has really great respect for the Catholic Church, was able to make some comparisons here. She says, the LDS Church would have had a different response to rape victims than the Catholic Church, based on respect for the girl's dignity and well-being as a daughter of God. Abortion in the case of rape would be seen as a possible legitimate decision after prayerful consideration and consultation. But maybe that is because the leadership of the LDS Church is composed of men who have had loving, committed, intimate relationships with women and are the fathers of both sons and daughters. Leaders of the Roman Catholic Church are by principle neither. They have neither been lovers of women or the fathers of 10-year-old daughters. I think that's interesting where she points out that, the leaders of the church are married and therefore might have some unique perspectives on women. She continues, indeed, the most nuanced and sophisticated understanding concerning abortion is not to be found in the Catholic tradition at all, despite its 2,000-year history. Is to be found in the LDS tradition with its less than 200-year history. Elder Dallin H. Oakes' 1999 talk on the subject is the finest example of moral reasoning on abortion to be found anywhere. Elder Oakes' talk manifests the power and reality of restoration, which clears the scales from our eyes that have accumulated through centuries of living with the erroneous traditions of the fathers concerning women's place and women's value in God's eyes. We must not downplay the distinctiveness of our vision on such an important matter. The restoration really is distinct and beautiful how it frames this. Some ask, but when does meaningful life begin? When would we consider something an abortion? Is it right at conception? Is it when the spirit enters the body? Elder Oakes and Elder Nelson, President Nelson, when he was Elder Nelson, addressed some of this. So Elder Nelson said this, it is not a question of when meaningful life begins or when the spirit quickens the body. In biological science, it is known that life begins when two germ cells unite to become one cell, bringing together 23 chromosomes from both the father and from the mother. The continuum of growth results in a new human being. Elder Oak said, our attitude toward abortion is not based on revealed knowledge of when mortal life begins for legal purposes. It is fixed by our knowledge that, according to an eternal plan, all of the spirit children of God must come to this earth for a glorious purpose. And Elder Maxwell, I thought, put it well when he said, have we strayed so far from God's second great commandment, love thy neighbor, that a baby in a womb no longer qualifies to be loved, at least as a mother's neighbor? So basically, what the church leaders have taught is that it really doesn't matter when meaningful life begins or when life begins for legal purposes. It's about when that very beginning of life starts. So here's a question that comes up often. What about pushing our beliefs on others? Isn't that what the church is doing in terms of abortion? Shouldn't we let people use their agency? Well, now, of course, agency is a really important principle. But it's also important to point out that probably the worst legal defense ever would be if somebody broke a law, they get up to the judge and say, well, but people should be able to do whatever they want, right? That would be a terrible, if you don't mind me saying so, basis for laws in our society. Would be just, well, let's let people do whatever they want. Again, the church gets involved when it sees danger or harm happening to individuals. And we can fully expect that laws will be created to keep people, prevent people from injuring or harming other individuals and creating a society that none of us really want to live in. The church has clearly seen that in the case of abortion, that is what happens, is that there is harm to individuals, harm to a society when it's legal for any reason. Now, let's turn our attention to birth control and family planning. When do we have kids? How many kids do we have? Here's a student comment. One of your readings was in the Truth of the Faith. And I think it's interesting what the student pointed out here. The student says, I've always been confused about the church's stance on birth control, and the reading from True to the Faith just confused me more. Not once did the reading mention birth control. It just discussed the importance of intimacy and bringing children into the world. Well, let's look at that statement from the True to the Faith and see if we can find out something about it that will give us a bit more direction. So the True to the Faith states, one, that we need to consider the sanctity, there's that word again, and meaning of life, part of the joy that comes when children are in the home. Consider the eternal blessings that come from having a good posterity. Right? So first we need to think about it. We need to gain some testimony. Then with a testimony of these principles, you and your spouse will be prepared to prayerfully decide how many children to have and when to have them. Such decisions are between the two of you and your mother. Oh, wait, hold on. That wasn't correct. Such decisions are between the two of you and the Lord, right? It's between the couple and the Lord. Again, if life is sacred, we let the Lord be part of making this most sacred and important of decisions. But we first need to gain a testimony of the Lord's plan, the meaning, sanctity of life, the eternal blessings that come, right? So then we'll be prepared to decide how many children to have and when to have them. And currently the church has no directions on what kinds of birth control to use in order to decide how many children to have and when to have them. It doesn't say, hey, use this kind of birth control or not that kind of birth control. Obviously, as we mentioned, abortion is out in terms of a form of birth control, but it's left to the couple to make that decision in consultation with the Lord. Here's a student comment. It said, concerning when a couple discusses having children, what if both spouses receive differing revelations? Say, if the husband believes very strongly the children should be conceived right away, but the wife feels very strongly that they should wait. How would you sort this out in a loving manner? How would you determine which spouse had the right answer? Well, that's a really good question and happens along a lot of lines within marriage in terms of, hey, the spouses aren't quite on the same page. Well, you work to get to the same page, right? How do we lovingly do this? Go back to the discussion we had on communication. How do we have cooperative communication where we're truly trying to understand each other and we're truly trying to understand what the Lord wants? And we don't just leave it, because just leaving it is a decision in and of itself, but we work with our spouse to try to find the answer. And we look and see what their revelation is, and we look at our revelation and say, okay, how do these actually make sense in some ways together? Now, birth control. What kinds of birth control should you use? I find that this is an important discussion to have, but you need to talk about it with your healthcare provider. That's really important. You and your healthcare provider should discuss the different options for birth control and also note the side effects. If chemical birth control is chosen, it's important to note that chemical birth control messes with your chemicals, and you might need to try a variety of chemical birth controls. messes with hormones, messes with one's emotions. Sometimes, if, for example, the woman gets on birth control just a week or so before the wedding, she might find out that that type of birth control really messes with her hormones, and then the whole wedding process is really a difficult thing. It's a better idea to, if the couple decides together with the Lord that they're going to wait to have children, to get on the birth control much, much earlier, so that it can be determined what is most effective with the body. Now, here comes the question, well, what if we just don't feel ready for kids? We have to also note this: no birth control is 100% effective. So we also need to understand that the sexual relationship comes with the responsibility for any child conceived. We've been pretending up to this point that using birth control or not using birth control allows us to determine how many children to have and when to have them. Guess what? Very often, our decisions don't play out exactly how we would want them to. And so we move forward with faith with whatever happens in terms of our children. Now, one last comment here as we close. This is my grandfather. Dear, dear, dear to me. Wonderful doctor, wonderful husband, father, grandfather. He was born in 1926. His mother was born in 1906. His mother became pregnant out of wedlock. So she was just 20 at the time when she had her son. And at that time, of course, being pregnant out of wedlock was an enormous stigma, so much more than it would be today. Less than 5% of children at that time were born out of wedlock. And this was extremely difficult for his mother. In fact, her brother really pressured her to abort the child. Well, she held firm, had her son, who was the joy of her life, who was somebody that gave her such great pleasure throughout her entire life. And she's so grateful. We're all so grateful that she made the decision that she did. All life, may I say, just to end, is valuable. It's of infinite worth. And I'm so grateful to be part of a church that affirms that infinite value of each and every one of us.